everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade, the Director of Social Science Matrix, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's panel, Leaving Afghanistan, which we are presenting in partnership with Berkeley's Institute of International Studies. Leaving Afghanistan, of course, refers to the withdrawal of the remainder of US troops from the country as we approach what would have been a 20th anniversary of a long war and military presence on the ground. More tragically, leaving Afghanistan evokes the tens of thousands of people who have departed the country in recent weeks under tremendously painful, chaotic, and dangerous circumstances, and the many more who might still be trying to leave at this very moment or will in the near future. So let me just say a few words about Matrix. And for those of you who are new, we are a cross-disciplinary social science research institute at UC Berkeley. Today's event is the first of our Matrix on Point series of the semester. It's a series devoted to panel discussions on important matters of the moment. We have many upcoming events and we are working on more, but let me just mention a few. On October 15th, we will have an in-person book salon with our very own geography PhD student, Xiaowei Wang, who will speak about their book, Blockchain Chicken Farm. On October 25th, we'll have an in-person Matrix on Point panel on new directions in studying policy. And on October 29th, we will have a virtual discussion on the rights and lives of non-citizens. You can check our Matrix website for further details, and you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter. Now, let me introduce the moderator of today's panel, and he will in turn introduce our panelists. So Daniel Sargent is Associate Professor of History and the Goldman School of Public Policy. He specializes in US foreign policy and the history of international relations. His research has explored how states and decision makers adapt to long-term changes in their international environments, and he's presently interested in how the United States has strived to constitute and sustain the international order. He is the author of A Superpower Transformed, the Remaking of American Foreign Relations in the 1970s, and has published essays in numerous journals and edited volumes. He is currently working on another book, Pax Americana, A History of the American World Order, under contract with Princeton University Press. So without further ado, I now turn to Daniel for the rest of the introductions. Thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you, Marion. And let me just start with a note of thanks to my colleagues at Social Science Matrix, Marion, Eva, and Chuck, for putting together a really vital panel on an immensely important and urgent topic, and that they've put this together with remarkable velocity. They've assembled an extraordinary cast, is just a testament to all the excellent work that they are doing. I'm going to be moderating today's session. So in that role, I'd like first to introduce our four speakers, each of whom will then begin with a brief presentation of about 12 minutes. And once we've heard from our four speakers, then we will sort of go to a general Q&A discussion, which I will moderate. And members of the audience are, of course, very welcome to pose questions through the chat. We only have 20-25 minutes allotted for questions and answers. So I have to say at the outset, we're not going to be able to answer all of your questions, but I will strive to assimilate as many of your questions as I can into sort of compound questions that I hope will answer the questions that you undoubtedly have. So first, introductions, and I'm going to provide these introductions in the sequence in which our presenters will be speaking. First up, we're going to hear from Omar Sharifi, who is Assistant Professor of Social Sciences and Humanities at the American University of Afghanistan and the Country Director of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies. He is the former Senior Research Fellow and Kabul Director of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, and he's also worked as a National Consultant for UNICEF Afghanistan. He is a Fellow at the Asia Society and a member of Afghan 21 Young Leaders Forum. Omar graduated from Kabul Medical Institute in 2003. Following his medical studies, he worked as head of research and publications for the Foundation for Culture and Civil Society in Kabul and as director of the Open Media Fund for Afghanistan. Omar has written several essays on social and political issues in Afghanistan, and his articles have been published in national and international journals. Next up on our panel, we're going to hear from Robert Cruz, who is professor of history at Stanford University, and he's a faculty member whose research and teaching interests focus on Afghanistan, Central and South Asia, Russia, Islam, and global history. He is the author of Afghan Modern, The History of a Global Nation, and For Prophet and Tsar, Islam and Empire in Russia and Central Asia. He is also the co-editor of Under the Drones, Modern Lives in the Afghanistan-Pakistan Borderlands, and The Taliban and the Crisis of Afghanistan. He has served as director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford. And he is currently editor-in-chief of the journal Afghanistan. Next up on our panel, we're going to hear from Dipali Mukhopadhyay, who is associate professor in the global policy area at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Her research focuses on the relationships between political violence, state building, and governance during and after war. She is currently serving as senior expert on the Afghanistan peace process for the United States Institute of Peace. She is the author of Good Rebel Governance, Revolutionary Politics and Western Intervention in Syria with Kimberly Howe, and of Warlords, Strongman Governors and State Building in Afghanistan. Her publications also include articles in Conflict, Security and Development, International Negotiation, Perspectives on Politics, as well as a series of policy-oriented writing and book chapters in edited volumes. She is vice president of the American Institute of Afghan Studies and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Then finally, we're going to hear from Georgi Derluguian, who is professor of social research and public policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Georgi's first-hand study of Soviet collapse culminated in the award-winning monograph, Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus. Its main question was simple: what processes and contingencies transformed the provincial Soviet intellectuals, once enamored with French cinema and sociology, into ferocious guerrilla fighters for the nationalist and religious causes? In the past, Georgi has taught as an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Northwestern University. He's been a visiting professor at Sciences Po and the Université de Bordeaux in France, as well as at Tallinn Technical University in Estonia and Kiev State University in Ukraine. Now, with our introductions out of the way, let me turn the microphone over to our first panelist, which is going to be Omar. So Omar, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Talking about like the title of the sort of the conference about the sort of leaving Afghanistan and stuff. I think for a lot of the Afghans, when we look at Afghanistan in general and stuff, they don't just see it as just simply leaving Afghanistan. It's just, or after Afghanistan, it's just like simply for a lot of people, it's just an abandonment. And while the studies of Afghanistan, understanding Afghanistan, especially the longest sort of war of the United States, in which the United States kind of remained engaged with Afghanistan, for a lot of us, for a lot of Afghans, it was not just simply a war, it was also an age of transformation. A transformation that actually, in a way, for the first time in the history, Afghanistan, in a way, exposed to what today we call international community. And with the international community comes a lot of rules and regulations and the donor community and all these new concepts introduced for us, that how we have to, in a way, organize ourselves to somehow conform to this image that the United States and the world wanted us to be. But if I can just kind of summarize the entire sort of like engagement of the international community, and specifically the United States in Afghanistan, I have to say that it began with no policy, with little understanding of Afghanistan, and left without any sort of thinking about the consequences, and in a way planning about what will be next. And in a sense, we cannot, I mean, people might say a lot of things about Afghanistan, but the engagement of the international community with Afghanistan, specifically the United States, was in a way suffered from several problems, beginning that nobody understood Afghanistan as a country and as a people and as a human beings. in a sense that because Afghanistan has never been part of some major colonial power in its course of history, so the thinking, behavior, and in a way, understanding of themselves and the world was very different from those who actually experienced colonial sort of rule. In that sense, when the United States and when the world came to Afghanistan, there was a gap in terms of a gap of understanding. And when the United States kind of become deeper and deeper engaged with Afghanistan, for a lot of Afghans, the way the international community and specifically the United States actually dealt with the Afghan problem, with the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda, with Pakistan and everything else, kind of remained an enigma because everybody knew what was the problem. Everybody knew why we don't move ahead and why the war continues for so long, but somehow nobody really took it seriously for two important reasons. First reason was that there was no Afghan voice in the whole sort of international intervention in Afghanistan. Because when the United States came to Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, it was the first time in the history of us in which we actually seen that many foreigners. Before that, our whole experience with the foreigners was just simply Anglo-Afghan wars, the Soviet invasion, and a lot of hippies. And it was the first time actually confronted with all this thing, a phenomenon that was called the international community. And none of us actually spoke English or in a way was able to actually communicate with them. And given that the fact that after 1978 and the sort of the communist coup d'etat in Afghanistan, there were no reading, understanding, and studying of Afghanistan in depth. When the Americans and when the international community came to Afghanistan, they lacked the tools and the means to sort of like look at Afghanistan and try to understand it. So in a sense, both sides in a way worked together in a vacuum. And that vacuum was filled by what we today call the Afghan diaspora. Those who came from the West and some of the researchers and others who came from the West and trying to sort of explain in a very micro level how Afghanistan functions. But at the end of the day, that all their analysis and stuff, or at least I have to say most of their work kind of remained in a very local level. And it never somehow managed to kind of bridge the gap. But at the same time, with the coming of the international community and especially the United States and Afghanistan, the society transformed itself. Because for the first time, Afghanistan, after a decade of absolute isolation and 2 decades of war, by the time the United States came to Afghanistan, the Afghans actually were connected to the world. So they tried to read the world, trying to understand the world, trying to even in a very basic level, trying to learn the language, to talk to them. It took a few years. But at the end of the day, it was not enough. So today that the United States left Afghanistan, or in the minds of a lot of Afghans, abandoned Afghanistan back to Taliban, to Pakistan, and to Al-Qaeda, the major question in the minds of a lot of us is, what was the purpose of the entire enterprise? When the world came to Afghanistan, and at the end of the day, they left it without answering the major questions, why they came and why they left. Nobody, at the end of the day, very few people, I mean, thanks to some scholars who actually worked on Afghanistan and stuff and tried to explain what was going on, but in major level, in a level of policy making and level of thinking about it, Afghanistan remained a land of exotic tribal things in which the Taliban, through the works of some people, found justification. And the Taliban, in a way, from being a group who harbored Al-Qaeda, who literally committed genocide in Afghanistan, somehow transformed into being a political partner for money. So now we are kind of in a threshold of history in which the Afghans actually for the first time experienced connection with the world after the terrible experience of the 1990s in which they were completely cut from the world. And now, when they came to the point after 20 years in which they actually developed the means to actually communicate with the world changed and transformed. And they realized that they are left alone and they are abandoned. So now we are, in a sense, facing a situation in which a generation in Afghanistan was born with connection with the world, with the values that actually define the modern world, such as human rights, such as women's rights, such as freedom of speech, such as respect for human dignity. And when the Afghans came to the point at which understand and in a way be able to actually define it for themselves and for the world the way they wanted, the world left Afghanistan. So for now, we are in this terrible situation in which most of the gains that we had as just normal citizens of a country now being either completely lost or being threatened. And so, but one thing that happened, and one thing that kind of distinguished this specific period and this specific generation from every other generation from before, is that the Afghans now learned, they found, thanks to international community's help, that they have the opportunity to educate themselves, to learn how to communicate with the world, something that since 15th century is unique in our history. Now the Taliban are back in power, Al-Qaeda is roaming around, and Pakistanis are controlling, Pakistani ISI are controlling the Taliban. In this situation, I think their voices in Afghanistan actually cannot talk about, that cannot accept going back to the medieval period. Whether the world listened to it or not, I think one thing that we've learned is that we cannot move forward without being connected. And we are in a situation in which, despite a lot of pessimism about Afghanistan, there are people here on the streets of Kabul, on the streets of Herat, on the streets of Mazar-e-Sharif, in Kandahar, in Jalalabad, everywhere around the country, who wants their voice to be heard. And the fact that we see every day that the women are coming on the streets and demanding their rights is a unique phenomenon in our history. So if we kind of wrap up the entire story of Afghanistan from the time that the United States came and the time that they left after 20 years, is that a lot of things may seem very not changed in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of the Afghan, a lot has changed. And for the first time in 40 years, they have a voice, and they want that voice to be heard.
Thank you, Omar, for that really powerful presentation. And all I'm going to do for now is to turn over the microphone to our next panelist, Robert, who I think is going to be using a slideshow.
Yes.
So Robert, over to you.
Let me start by thanking everyone at Berkeley. It's an honor to be here, especially because you've chosen such an amazing panel with a number of my favorite scholars of all time. So thank you. It's really an honor to be here. So I will use my 10 minutes to offer a perspective. It's partial, really responding to some of the conversation that Omar brilliantly, I think, summarized for us, and looking at this again from a kind of American lens, from an historical lens. And what struck me about the conversation that I've been having with some colleagues and friends, and just seeing the American conversation, really, I think is really highlighted in this slide, which some of you may recognize from the New Yorker, a piece by John Lee Anderson, which asked, is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan the end of the American empire? And what strikes me about this conversation really is the small commentary above, ojalá, in Spanish, posted by a Latin American historian colleague, who writes here, I hope so, or I wish, or inshallah would be a kind of cousin, really taking a kind of joy in what he hopes will be the collapse of the American empire in Afghanistan. It strikes me that a lot of our conversation on the left is actually is finding some kind of schadenfreude in this moment, and it's really looked at it, I think, through a critical lens, thinking about this as a kind of colonial war, which I would embrace and applaud. I think that's always been the story from 2001 to the present. But now we're at a messy moment where, an empire, if we use that term in this context, has collapsed in this setting. And what that means for the world is a bigger conversation, which I hope we'll get to yet. But I thought I would try to shift the conversation, because I think this framing of it is problematic in so many ways, because in the end, it's really about us. It's about us. I think, Omar's critique was spot on, that for too long, we in the United States have looked at this really through a narrow framing of a supposed American national interest. Leaving behind, of course, I think, some of the scenes captured by the brilliant Marcus Yam, who photographs for the LA Times. This is an image from a day which was momentous, I think, and that we'll return to again and again in the future. A day when some of the victims of an American drone strike, ostensibly against Islamic State in Kabul, coincided with the final departure of the last American plane. So these are men, relatives of these young victims, which included a number of children, looking to the skies, I think, in one of the most powerful portraits I've seen in 20 years. So looking at from this vantage point, obviously I can't comment on all Afghans' experiences. As Omar stressed, it's an incredibly heterogeneous, diverse, complicated society that's only grown more complicated over the last 2 decades. But in thinking through empire, thinking through what the withdrawal means for Afghans, I propose to look at a subset of Afghan society, look at a set of communities that I've been studying for the last few years, the Hazaras. Many people know them because they featured in say, The Kite Runner. Some Hazaras identify their community as being fundamentally an ethnic one. Some regard it instead as a religious one. Even the category of Hazara is contested in some sense. Many of my interlocutors have rejected the label that we commonly see in our press, identifying them as Shi'i Muslims. Instead, many Hazaras want to stress that they, in fact, are secular. So it's a fascinating community that has really, I think, emerged in the last 2 decades, and it really exemplifies some of the trends that Omar was pointing to. They've become essential, indeed crucial, to the emergence of a kind of civil society in Afghanistan since 2001. They've been at the forefront of education, of media, of all kinds of social activism. Hazara youth have been absolutely fundamental in changing the society, and here the roles of men and women have been absolutely fundamental. Because of their minority status, they've been advocates of a more pluralistic and egalitarian society. At the same time, across generations, they have seized a new public role for Shiism. And again, there's a great deal of religious heterogeneity among Hazaras, but one important development, especially in Kabul, but also in Herat, Mazar Sharif, even Kandahar, has been that for the first time in Afghan history, Shiism has emerged in a new kind of, in public spaces, within a degree of toleration, if we put it in a kind of broad, universal sense. And yet we also find Hazara intellectuals who are advocates of anti-clericalism, of secularism, even of atheism, in Afghanistan, in the diaspora. So they are pushing at the pluralization of Afghan society from a new position, which they built upon the foundations of 2001. What's especially striking, if we think about Afghan history and the history of Hazaras in particular, is that so much of this is really an alternative to a history that they remember as one being stamped by a legacy of genocide. First, in the 1890s, when we see the modern Afghan state really being built partly on the backs of the conquest of regions inhabited by Hazaras, defined as religious enemies, and then ultimately targeted for genocide and mass displacement, mass removal. As Omar mentioned, the Taliban also engaged in these politics in the 1990s, most famously in 1998 when they attacked the city of Mazar Sharif and killed several thousand men and boys, but also engaged in crimes of sexual violence against Hazara women, as well as other communities in Mazar Sharif. I'd like to introduce a few images here now to look at more closely. Nasir Turkmani is an amazing Hazara artist and intellectual who has tried to think through Hazara history through this legacy of genocide by mixing family portraits and documents in a way to create a kind of counter narrative of documentation to create a different kind of history for Hazara people. In thinking about this history, I would also highlight that there's a very distinctive narrative here in some ways that represents potentially all Afghans at some level, but also which is quite unique. So just to point to a few differences about the Hazara experience. For the Hazaras, the war of the last 2 decades has not been about aerial bombardment, drone attacks, night raids, signature airstrikes by NATO and the US forces, open-ended detention and torture, which it was for many, especially rural Pashtun communities. Instead, the Hazaras faced a nearly decade-long campaign in the last decade, a sustained campaign of terror, which aimed at erasing them as an ethnic, religious, and minority community. The most striking example that will be familiar to you all, I'm sure, is the striking photograph of a 13-year-old girl named Latifa Hashimi, who visited the school, the Said al-Shuhada school, after it was bombed in May 2021. And here, some of the attacks on Hazara majority hospitals, schools, demonstrations, religious gatherings, and on notable individuals have been contested. Some claimed by Islamic State, some claimed by Taliban, some perhaps claimed by Al-Qaeda. But for many Hazara interlocutors, they make a very interesting argument, which I think is worth hearing now as we reflect on this from the point of view of the United States, that through this lens, there's no difference among these groups. So I think it's an important, I think, rejoinder to the way we parse and try to distill different radical groups, because in the end, these communities have faced their violence, firsthand in an unrelenting way for at least a decade, in a very intense way. So this question about the identities of perpetrators raises a interesting question about Afghan politics if one sees it through this Hazara lens. And again, I'm simplifying here because there are of course multiple Hazara lenses on each of these questions. But I think what's worth dwelling on for a moment is the ambiguity about the identities of the perpetrators of such acts. Were these acts of violence by the Taliban, by Islamic State? Are there meaningful differences among them? I think what's important for us in reflecting on the last 2 decades is to realize that for the victims of many of these attacks, the ambiguity of the identity of the attackers was less important than a concrete force they could point to, and that was a state that failed to offer them security, even though particular neighborhoods, especially in the west of Kabul, were targeted again and again. So in thinking of the long list of failures of the Afghan government, we should highlight this one as well, that through the lens of this violence, more and more Hazara intellectuals and just common people came to see the governments of Hamid Karzai and then Ashraf Ghani as that of politicians who were actively engaged in an agenda of ethnicizing Afghan politics at the expense of minority communities. So the inability to provide security, even in Kabul, even in areas where Hazaras were known to be congregating, I think was a major weakness of the Afghan state that we failed to recognize looking at it externally. At the same time, to add another layer of complication, from at least 2014, regional politics across this space really conspired to place the Hazaras in an even more vulnerable position, because Iran formed a unit of fighters from among Afghan Hazara migrants in Iran, some drawn from Afghanistan itself, which they named the Fatemiyoun Brigade, which they sent to Syria to fight on the side of Bashar al-Assad. So this fueled already, deep underlying narratives about the supposed dual loyalty of Hazaras, because they are mostly Shia, that is, they mostly share the religion of Iran. This fueled arguments that they in fact form a kind of fifth column against the Afghan nation. So this added another layer of complexity, the broader regional configuration. The use of Hazaras against the opponents of Bashar al-Assad added to the vulnerability of this community by suggesting they were a kind of fifth column. In recent years, if we look at just to focus in on the last 3 or 4 years, for those of us, I think, following Afghan politics and particularly following Hazara politics, I think we can trace a rising sense of anxiety about the role of the international community in essentially betraying the status of the Hazaras, which they've fought so hard over the last 2 decades. This is an amazing work of satire by the Hazara artist Khadim Ali, who now works out of Australia, but who's also been working in Kabul until August of this month, or mid-August. This is a statement on COVID. It's called "That Is How It Was," dated 2020. And you can see from the snapshot of this that, of course, there's the references to the COVID and this amazing miniature art here with the oxygen tank. But for our purposes, what's most striking, I think, is the sense that Donald Trump and Scott Morrison of Australia are not only famous for, of course, mismanaging COVID and for engaging in anti-immigration politics. I think Khadim Ali is pointing to a kind of looming betrayal, as Omar noted, as the Taliban became more and more of a political actor in the eyes of Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and other states, really setting the stage for what has transpired in the last 6 months. Returning to Nasir Turkmani, and I'll begin to wrap up. I've about exhausted my time here. The story of Hazara success, which we learned so much about in realms of education and media, has also been accompanied by a very painful story of the last 2 decades of continued marginalization within Afghan society. So Nasir Turkmani has also devoted much of his work to photographing working people, orphans, older male and female members of the community, to really shed light on the continued marginalization, poverty, and what he would call discrimination ongoing against this community over the last 2 decades, even alongside all the gains that Hazara men and women, especially young people, have made in various spheres. Some of Nazi Turkmeni's most, I think, poignant images, with which I'll conclude, really speak to loss and to looming anxiety about genocide under Taliban rule. These are portraits of small neighborhoods in and around Kabul, where the figures in red are cast as victims of recent terror attacks who are now lost to the community. They are now present, but absent, of course, painted here. In red, another striking image of, I think this is of people approaching a cemetery to reflect upon people martyred in these mysterious attacks, often unclaimed by any actor. I'll conclude now with a photograph. I think this was Nazi Turkmeni's last photograph from Sarapul in Kabul as he left the country in late August. Again, I think highlighting a sense of loss. These are flags celebrating Muharram, an important Shi'i calendar marking the death at Karbala of Imam Hussein. And what's striking about this, I think, is a sense of loss that, you know, these are expressions of public Shi'i piety, and yet he's in a sense saying goodbye to them. And I think it's a very striking kind of fragment of a moment that will soon be lost to us. And now we have many Hazaras and allies pointing to Panjshir, where there's a remaining opposition movement, and they're also speaking about Panjshir as, you know, a new kind of Karbala, a place where you know, the heroes fighting on the side of justice are being martyred by the forces of injustice and corruption. So to conclude, while for many in the West, and from the point of view of Latin America, I appreciate that this you know, seems to be a cause for celebration for all critics of empire. I certainly understand the point of view, but if we reflect upon even one community, even the very snapshot, a very partial view I've tried to offer, we see an enormous tragedy unfolding of mass flight, of the reversal that Omar poignantly described, the sense of loss. And I think strikingly, you know, it's not exaggeration to warn of the potential of genocide at this moment. And I fear that at this stage, shifting to Dipali's turn, the American administrations of the last 2 decades have left the world with no options here. And so I think now we stand at the precipice not only of the return of groups that we associate with terrorism, but also fundamentally one that we should associate with genocide, and that now has extraordinary power, arms, and wealth to make that happen. And the world is powerless, I think, to do really anything about it, militarily or otherwise. So I end there on a very grim note, but thank you for your patience. And again, I look forward to our conversation. And thank you to everyone at Berkeley for having me.
Great. Thank you, Robert, for that very somber presentation and conclusion. And I think you've provided a better segue to Dipali than I could. So let me just say over to you, Dipali.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to Marion for the invitation. It's a privilege, and it's sort of a sober occasion to be part of this conversation. I think the comments that Omar and Bob have made are very resonant with my own sort of dark mood at the moment. And I thought I would start by just sharing some of the dozens and dozens of messages that have been streaming onto my phone from morning until night for the past few weeks. People writing things like, is there still any chance, any hope? I have been super stressed and I don't know what to do. I'm very sorry for being too clingy. I feel embarrassed, but I had no other option. I never thought it would come to this. I'm out of plans. Nothing seems to work. These are messages that have been coming onto my phone and onto many people's phones all over the world, from professors and soldiers and journalists, from poets and students and government officials. Dozens of Afghans from different walks of life, and they have one thing in common, and that is that they are being hunted now by the resurgent Taliban. And most of them begin their notes with a list of credentials, the degrees that they've earned or the awards that they've won, books they've authored, jobs that they've held. And most of them close with some version of a desperate plea of, please help me. I think for me, the catastrophe of the evacuation is a kind of coda that punctuates and exemplifies the American project of building states in the service of the so-called war on terror. The past 20 years were in part about the project of building an Afghan state, but more importantly, they were part of this quest on the part of the United States and its allies to avenge the attacks on September 11th and to stamp out the networks that perpetrated them. And in that sense, building an Afghan state was a means toward an end, not an end in and of itself. And state building in the service of countering extremism has always been about the creation of a regime that would be loyal to and dependent on outsiders. The very design of that government ensured that it would be fragile. And its rapid demise was less of a surprise to those of us, I think, who understood that logic at the root of the project. You know, in the American collective imagination, American troops in Afghanistan have not taken up a lot of space in the last few years. And that's in part because American soldiers were really serving more of a political role than a military one. Their boots on the ground represented a commitment of sorts to the fledgling Afghan republic, and that served the purpose of encouraging an otherwise unwieldy elite to stay invested in the preservation of the government, and also served to deter the Taliban from pushing for an all-out military takeover. I think a lot of observers, myself included, believed in the merit of an eventual American withdrawal, but we knew that the way in which that withdrawal was managed could mean the difference between a viable peace process and the government's collapse. And we in particular knew and cautioned that a precipitous unconditional withdrawal was bound to be read by all involved as a defection on the part of the world's most powerful nation. And any incentive the Taliban had to negotiate with the Afghan government would evaporate. And otherwise, brave and well-trained soldiers in the Afghan army, which was dependent on US support by design, they would lose their will to fight. I made my last trip to Kabul just weeks after the Biden announcement, and the trip started with a birthday party for the daughter of one of my closest friends there. And even in the middle of those festivities, you could feel that our hosts and guests were anxious. They were alarmed about how out of touch the president of Afghanistan seemed to be in this moment of existential reckoning. And they were also shocked by how quickly they were being abandoned by their American friends. And it's important to be very clear that these were not victims looking to be saved, you know, to borrow the language of Laila Abulugo. They were citizens seeking accountability for promises that had been made to them by their political leaders and by their foreign partners. So in that moment of celebration, none of us knew that just a few months later, they would be forced into this panicked exodus and sitting for days on buses in the heat in Kabul while Talibs checked and rechecked their documents, most of them getting turned away, a few of them being able to make it into the airport. And while their journey commenced, I was at home making these lists with names like French Connection, Charter Flight Moonshot, Scholars at Risk, Hail Mary. I was part of this motley crew of veterans and journalists and philanthropists and scholars who were running these makeshift war rooms, trying to help our Afghan friends navigate into the airport, into the gates controlled by the US Marines and onto flights. There were all sorts of chains of encrypted text messaging and satellite imagery and trying to figure out the gaps and loopholes in the American bureaucracy, trying to marshal our networks to share information and strategize and lobby. And every list I made involved this obscene set of calculations. You know, are there too many children in this family to include them on the list? Has the way this journalist framed this threat, is it scary enough to get attention? Will women make for more compelling victims than men? And all of my collaborators in this effort carried their own lists, and we were negotiating with each other, hoping that if we provided information, we could get a spot on a flight for someone on our list. And it was really the indecent work of turning productive, capable agents of change into objects for rescue. And for me, it kind of crystallized the crux of the problem when it comes to state building in the service of the so-called war on terror. The states that get built are not designed to be sovereign. Their budgets are dependent on aid. Their security sectors rely on foreign equipment and foreign contractors. Negotiations elevate insurgents and marginalize their diplomats, and their citizens are afforded some rights sometimes, but not if those freedoms undermine the geopolitical interests of more powerful states. And so that's how it happens that in the flash of an eye, those more powerful states transform the Taliban from this mortal enemy into a security partner at the airport, because now there's a scarier terrorist, the Islamic State, on the horizon. And that's how it happens in the flash of an eye, that friends and partners of the United States in Afghanistan learned that they were in fact dispensable once their more powerful patrons decided to move on. So in that sense, the end of the American war is not very different from its beginning, but the hypocrisy undergirding the effort is now particularly on display. Because today we see this insidious narrative taking hold, this notion that the United States and its allies tried so hard to give the Afghan people and their leaders a chance at democracy, but they didn't take us up on that generous offer. And now it's time for us to admit that promoting governance abroad is hard to do, and we're better off focusing on matters at home. And I think it's very important for me personally that that narrative not stand. It is imperative to stress in this moment that the American invasion of Afghanistan was for its own ends, and it unfolded in terms that crippled the state building project, crippled the democratization effort in a number of meaningful ways. It deliberately created dependencies and conditionalities and restrictions that in effect doomed the project before it even began. I do think, though, that an opportunity still remains to seize on the positive externalities of these efforts, the positive effects that Omar underscored. And that is like the tragic, for me, paradox at the heart of this war, that opportunities to embrace citizenship and globalization and cosmopolitanism were opened up by the intervention in 2001, even as they were simultaneously threatened and undermined by the means of that intervention as it ran its course. But I think now there is still an opportunity to recognize our Afghan interlocutors as profound agents of change in their own lives and in the course of their own country, and to think about what it might look like for the Western world to engage with them finally on their terms rather than on ours. So I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great, thank you for that powerful and sort of lucid and compelling presentation. Let me now turn the microphone over to our last panelist, Georgi, and then after we've heard from Georgi, then we'll go to a question and answer session in which the audience is invited to engage. Georgi, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. It's difficult to be the last always. Fortunately, Dipali said almost everything which was necessary to say about why this state failed there. I would just add that it's very difficult to build a state in a country as poor, anywhere in the South. This is the second withdrawal from Afghanistan I'm watching since I'm former Soviet Union officer. I do remember very vividly the day Soviet troops went in December '79. Tells you how old I might be. I'm not going to engage in this usual bemoaning, that this is the grave of empires, nothing could be done about it, and why it should be. Let's take a bigger look. This is very difficult for historical sociologists like Marion and myself to analyze, because we try to look reasonable. And what has been happening in American foreign policy since at least 2000 was beyond reasonable. It was very difficult to predict for anyone that the most powerful military machine in the world might fall in the hands of this kind of ruling elites. Yet this happened. They were looking, let me remind you, those who might remember, the first about 8 months of the Bush Jr. administration. They were looking for a fight, and the fight was going to be with China. At that time, if you remember, there was an American spy airplane grounded in People's Republic, this kind of accident. And then 9/11 struck. And there was a massive reorientation, which many people considered from the outside to be accidental, something, a contingency, or maybe even crazy. But was it? You can see, that now, 20 years later, we could see what was the design. The design was really daring. It was world domination. That if you move into a place like Afghanistan, it is, let me remind you, very Central Asia. So you are not only to the south or east of China, you are to the west of China. You are to the south of Russia, you are to the north of India, and you are next to Iran. And once you move into Iraq, you're not only next to Iran and so many other very important states in that region, you are also central member of OPEC by default. So that was a really daring act, exploiting the opportunity, that Europe in the 1990s failed to constitute itself into a political actor. Japan, again, those who might be old enough remember, just the fear of Japanese economic robot in the 1980s. But Japan suddenly collapsed in the 90s into this zero growth. And the Soviet Union, even more spectacularly, had collapsed. So that was, it looked like, the moment, of course, to pursue the project of American century for another century. Now we see that it failed. So the question should be really, what is going to happen next? I'm wondering, actually, what might happen to all these post-Soviet regimes in Central Asian republics, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, even Kazakhstan. They seem patently defenseless, including against their own populations. They seem entirely dependent on foreign military assistance, but which one, who is going to defend them? Is it going to be Putin's Russia? Or is it going to be very eager Erdogan's Turkey, projecting their power now there? Is it going to be China by any chance? Is it going to be nobody? Is it going to be a big and spreading region of failed states? So these are all the questions, which used to be beyond the discussion because we didn't want to look kind of too outrageous. However, if you look back into the predictions of, say, Michael Mann, historical sociologist, our senior colleague at UCLA, who wrote in 2003, he published the book Incoherent Empire. This, let me remind you, was the time when it became rather fashionable in certain Western capitals to compare American empire to British empire in the past, and in a positive sense. The empire builders, as the builders of modernization. McMahon quite persuasively showed, revisit that book, Incoherent Empire, why it would not be possible today. Emanuel Wallerstein at the time, also wrote about American empire crash landing, the eagle has crash landed. It would be, at that time, so many people actually, I was on the job market, I must confess, and many people were suggesting that I might not even mention I ever knew such people, because this would damage my prospects. It was outside of the realm of thinkable and utterable at the time, yet it happened. This is why I think, so what we do, studying state power, studying it in social science ways, is not only very valid, it is what in Russian we used to call aktualna. You know, this is what needs to be done right now. Not only criticism and despair, but the actual thinking, we must not cede it to the professional geopolitics commentators in Washington. You know, we must also do that. And this is a moment of enormous danger. Let me not even mention, you know, that of course Pakistan is a major player, if not now the owner of Afghanistan. It's a nuclear power, which has its problems with India and quite a few other powers. So what is going to happen there? We are observing how all across Asia, new kind of imperialisms are emerging. We used to speak in despair or in great hope about the rise of capitalism in places like China, India, Turkey. Yeah, you know, they were revived. But with that revival, which was of course part of the decline of industrialism and labor movements in the West, we saw the revival of old imperial nationalism in the East. We see neo-Ottomanism, neo-Cynicism, neo-Chinese nationalism, neo-Russian nationalism. And it might be quite dangerous, you know, to see, you know, what might yet emerge from a place like Pakistan. Let me shut up here. I think, you know, we all spoke enough and in troubling tonality. Thank you.
Great, thank you for a really sort of hair-raising presentation. You know, you've all been impressively efficient in your presentation, so I'm glad to report that we have 30 minutes left for discussion, 5 minutes more than we budgeted, which is terrific because there is a great deal to discuss. And I'm going to launch a sort of first question that is a synthesis or adaptation of an audience question that I have received from Leonid Lira, who's one of the participants viewing today. And the question sort of invites us to ponder the applicability of the compound noun nation state, a noun that I think each of you used in your presentation in one context or another, to the circumstance of Afghanistan, a complex society in which the concept of a unitary nation state may or may not have been you know, applicable. So I wonder if we could sort of open up this section of the conversation by sort of reflecting upon the basic you know, viability of the effort by the United States, but building upon earlier sort of Afghan efforts enshrined in the '64 Constitution to construct a more or less unitary you know, system of political order in a society that may or may not have been hospitable to such a sort of conception. I don't know who wants to go first, but this seems like a sort of obvious place to start. I think, Robert, you have unmuted, so can I bring you in?
Oh, sorry, that was just reason, but you saw me. No, sure. I mean, very briefly, I guess you know, nation states are problematic everywhere. You know, Georgi reminded us of, you know, Pakistan's innate structural challenges. You know, the American nation state is a problematic concept, as we're learning, you know, in more and more complicated ways on a daily basis. So my inclination is not to pathologize Afghan state building as an historical phenomenon. I think, you know, but it makes it more difficult, as Georgi noted, to remind us of another important moment in context. I mean, it's very challenging to be a relatively small state in a neighborhood with lots of powerful actors, and to be at the receiving end of Soviet and American and now Pakistani, you know, intentions to control. So I think it's less than, you know, some of my Afghan colleagues would point to many decades of relative stability. You know, it's a bit of a monarchist argument, which I don't share necessarily, but yes, Afghanistan is multi-ethnic. It's complicated. Georgi noted that it's poor, right? All those things are true of Afghanistan and dozens of other countries, right? So I think, you know, I would not go down the road of kind of pathologizing, you know, the impossibility of an Afghan nation state. But the question, I think, is more about some of the contingencies that Omar and Dipali pointed to. And, you know, the question is, can can such a state be constructed from abroad? And to paraphrase Dipali, I mean, for what purposes, right? I think that was a beautiful formulation to suggest that the ambition was always to amplify, American power in one form or another. In that sense, it's very difficult to construct an organic leadership given those competing agendas. So I'd pause there and hear from others.
Great. Omar, you have a hand up.
Well, I'm talking about the whole, I was looking at the questions and I was thinking about talk about this whole idea of an Afghan nation state and stuff, and how we even conceive Afghanistan as a nation state, and where is the sense of nationalism in it. And it's like always when we read about this, when we read about Afghanistan in the international media, and specifically the American media and stuff, about all these sort of tribes with big turbans and stuff wandering around, and all these different ethnic groups and stuff, and ethnicity and religions and sects and everything else. And it's kind of creates sort of a lot of confusion about how we have to perceive this country or Afghanistan as a general. Is it a nation state? Is there any sense of nationhood in this country and stuff? And I actually kind of, being an Afghan and living in Afghanistan, growing up in Afghanistan, living all my life there and stuff, and it's actually the question for me, because once the international community came to Afghanistan after 2001, they kept asking me about my tribes and everything else, and it was kind of surprising thing for me. And I started to actually, after that, before that, I always thought okay, we are a nation and stuff, but then I realized at the same time that a lot of things that's kind of sort of nationalism in a lot of sort of European, Middle Eastern or other contexts actually doesn't make sense to me. I don't have a sense of nationalism like the Serbs have it, or the Georgians have it or stuff. But at the same time, and because I came from a country which is absolutely multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, there are a lot of different religious sects in that. But at the same time, I looked at this factor in Afghanistan. It's actually, Afghanistan is being a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multinational country, or sorry, multi-sectarian country. It's actually the only country from the Bengal to Balkans that never have or doesn't have at all right now a separatist movement. And so if you look at that in that sense, it's how that is possible. Not that all these different ethnic groups like each other. And also actually, whenever we talked about Afghanistan, everybody says oh, Afghanistan is a tribal society. And I know that the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, which is kind of one ethnic group, or somehow part of them are organized based on a kind of tribal system. But we have Tajiks, we have Uzbeks, we have Azaris, we have Turkmens, we have everybody who actually doesn't have any tribal system. So as an anthropologist, when I looked at that and I say, how that's possible? It's a country that's completely, in a way, extremely diverse in any level. And there is a history of violence between all these groups, and yet none of them want to secede. None of them want to, in a way, actually create a different country. And the sense of nationalism, the way it's kind of portrayed, manifested itself in Europe or in post-Soviet countries. It doesn't exist in Afghanistan. And even when in the 1990s, when we doesn't have a country, Afghanistan, after the collapse of the communist regime, sort of the government collapse, we have a civil war and stuff. Neither the Taliban nor the anti-Taliban forces never want to actually claim that they represent a specific ethnic group. They always claim the entirety. And so that was a question in which is how we have to understand a country that actually never had a colonial experience. And it's a completely, to me, that was there is a sense of historicity. I'm not saying this because I'm from Afghanistan, but actually I'm saying this because Afghanistan is actually the only sort of a country in the larger sort of Middle East and Central Asian region in which history never had a break, in a sense that we had a continuity. And that's why we even, and that the kind of a continuity, because we never had not a single institution in this country until 2000, in a way, 3 or 4, when the United States and the world tried to establish some sort of a Ministry of Defense or taxation or something. Actually, none of them actually we inherited from any colonial power. So in that sense, how this, in a way, that system works and how we have to put them together. But and this is a major question. I think that a lot of people, when they dealt with Afghanistan, they looked at us as tribes and groups and ethnic groups and religious groups and minorities and majorities, and actually never looked at human beings. Because in the minds of a lot of Afghans, oh yes, you're a Hazara, you're suppressed. You're a Tajik, you're this. You're a Pashtun, you're a suppressor or something else. But at the end of the day, this is sort of like a lot of Afghans, in a sense, looked at themselves as something that never experienced colonial sort of rule in the 9th century. But the negative sides of it was why Al-Qaeda came to Afghanistan, because in the minds of the Al-Qaeda, Afghans were seen as the only Muslim country on earth that ever managed in the both 19th and the 20th century who do a successful jihad. And for them, seeing that connectivity in terms of like a connecting sort of, it's all psychological in a sense, like how the psychology kind of history worked in the sense of it. So they looked at that as a way to actually even think about Khilafat or something else, as sort of like a Muslim Islamist utopia and stuff. But what is today? What we are dealing about today, when the Americans left, when the world abandoned, we're dealing with a generation who actually understands the divisions, who actually know and feel the fissures that actually define the Afghan society, who actually for the first time we recognize the atrocities, the problems that actually shaped Afghan society and how it, for instance, when Dr. Cruz talks about the Hazaras and stuff, but at the same time, we don't see a Hazara separatist movement, ever. We never see that. So, but kind of today's generation, like today, and at the same time, Afghanistan is portrayed as a kind of extremely patriarchal society, which, to be honest, it is. But at the same time, today, as today, like literally today, on 8th of September, 2021, it is the women in Herat, in Mazar, that came out and trying to challenge the Taliban, which actually put to shame a lot of my colleagues, a lot of men, which we are actually debating with each other, like, oh my God, we all thought that we are men and all these things with all this, our toxic masculinity, but these women are coming and trying to challenge Taliban. So actually, when we deal with Afghanistan, and I think that was one of the problems with the international community when they came and the American intervention, they tried to categorize Afghanistan into different things and never looked at us as a whole. And when they left Afghanistan, they still looked at Taliban as part of a category that can control other categories. But for a lot of Afghans, a sense of being human, a sense of having the right to have an education, a sense of having a right not to be blown up by a IED or something is actually make more sense than being divided by ethnic or tribal or sectarian groups. So when we look at this thing, I mean, understanding societies which has somehow remained out of the international order, colonial order, and define themselves is actually, I think, could be an interesting topic to see, like Afghanistan or Thailand or some very few countries on earth to actually come to that. And I think these are the spots through which we actually, in a way, may have a better understanding of how to create some respect for human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Georgi wants to get in on this question too.
State is something very valuable, as we are suddenly coming to realize in the 21st century. Of course, you know, much of the 20th century, especially in the end of 20th century, was about withering away of states. You know, first as a hope, you know, that we will be free, because state in the classical sense was about taxmen, police, and prisons, or maybe state religion as well. And that was quite the reality, you know, before the 19th century everywhere in the world. But then something happened with states in 20th century, and they developed these wonderful, incredible innovations like ministries of education, ministries of healthcare, which might have puzzled even French kings in their lifetime. You know, so why there would be anything like beyond the Ministry of War and Ministry of Taxation, the two most vital, you know, seniors of power. Why? Because state is simply a machinery of rule, which can be reprogrammed. You press certain buttons and a whole category of your population disappears into concentration camps. If it is an efficient state, it takes quite an efficient state to become totalitarian. But you program it differently and children start getting free lunches at school. So the question is why so many states are falling apart. And this is again, what was addressed on this panel earlier, because they were not designated even to exist as more or less independent or national state, because national is just one of the ways of justifying paying taxes. This is your state, so this is why you're paying, you owe it your allegiance, your sons should fight in its army, so forth. Why is this happening? This massive disillusionment on one side, the populations get disillusioned in states, and what states are mostly about corruption today. And why, somebody asked here, what did the United States did right or wrong in Afghanistan? And this is not a rhetorical question. It's a very important question. To me, it's actually a very important puzzle. Why this, I grew up with the expression in Soviet propaganda, the Saigon puppet regime. So the South Vietnamese regime in the 1960s became puppet, but South Korean regime became a modernization developmental state and eventually a democracy. So what's the difference between South Korea and South Vietnam? This guy. So what was done in Afghanistan and in Iraq, what might be happening now in places like Ukraine, which prevent them from becoming these legitimate national states. What might be possible there at all? This is the question for discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's, I think a segue to a question that I would like to put, I think initially to Dipali, because it's her talk that really opens up this question. Georgi cited an audience question, which posed very simply as the question of what did the United States do right, and where did the United States go wrong? And it's a wonderful question. It's very fundamental, and it points, I think, to what struck me as a deep tension within sort of Dipali's presentation. You, I think, persuasively, Dipali, characterize the project of nation building in Afghanistan as ultimately a self-serving project, animated by a clear view of American geopolitical interests and purposes. And yet you also explained in your presentation that the period of American occupation was a period when Afghanistan enjoyed new opportunity, Afghan society enjoyed new opportunity to integrate with a sort of more cosmopolitan, globalizing world, a world beyond sort of the self-serving instrumental purposes of the American occupiers. So I wonder, how we explain that tension within the experience of the past 20 years. How does the experience of occupation also function in a way as an opportunity for sort of building a more cosmopolitan Afghanistan?
I think, Daniel, it's the fundamental paradox that I still can't really get my head around. I think it's a deeper paradox, I think, at the heart of a lot of American foreign policy. I just, as you mentioned in the introduction, finished a book on Western engagement with the Syrian opposition, and there it was similarly so very clear that American engagement with the Syrian opposition early on was welcome and enabled a kind of lifeline to Syrians who were organizing under remarkably difficult conditions, gave them the possibility to access the rest of the world, gave them the possibility to take care of their own communities in the midst of a very brutal war. And at the same time kept them in a kind of geopolitical limbo in which the very kind of work involved in building a nation, which is really an internal kind of work, gets short-circuited by every interaction that is dictated by the outsiders. And so you end up in a circumstance in which you have political movements and political institutions kept on a kind of life support. And through that life support, new opportunities do emerge for people within those communities, and those are undeniable. And part of what is so painful about the current moment, you know, as Omar was describing it, is the reversal of those possibilities for people. But I think actually what is also really worth underscoring is a lot of these changes and openings did not begin in 2001. They actually have very deep roots in Afghanistan. So as you know, the activism of women in Afghan social and political life did not begin in 2001. It has actually roots that go in many cases deeper than they do in many parts of the Western world. The notion that, as you know, Omar was describing, of communities engaging one another across ethnic, sectarian, geographical lines in terms that conceive of the nation in ways that we assume we introduced, that the notion of constitutionalism, the notion of a marriage of secularism and religiosity, these are deeply rooted in Afghan history. And so what the intervention did was open up certain new spaces for them to reemerge, to take shape anew, to engage with the rest of the world. And our exit does not eliminate them, right? I mean, one of the things that's so striking about the protests across the country right now is they have nothing to do with outside actors. They have nothing to do with Western NGOs or Western newspapers, or, I mean, there's nobody else. It's an Afghan, in the most difficult, terrifying of circumstances, these deep habits and impulses and connections are able to continue. And so I think for me, mostly what the lesson is of what did the US do well and what did the US do poorly is to think with a certain new kind of humility about what the US is capable of doing. It's very capable of very precise forms of destruction that allow for regimes to be toppled, that allow for particular individuals to be surveilled, to be assassinated, to be detained, etc. It's capable of spending enormous amounts of money. It's capable of rallying other countries in the service of particular projects. But once beyond those big sort of moves, most of them, what happens is beyond the control of the US. And that means some very terrible things will happen and some very wonderful things will happen, but ultimately none of it can be carefully orchestrated. And that doesn't mean that we don't have responsibilities. Part of what is so depressing to me about the withdrawal is the one thing we knew we would do eventually would be to withdraw. And therefore we knew certain sets of people would be at risk. There would be certain consequences in the region, and we did not do the work to be prepared for that and to take responsibility for that. But fundamentally, I think these movements, these ideas, these impulses will continue even under the brutal boot of Taliban rule. They will persist. They persisted through the 90s and they will persist well into this new century. And I think what we can do is pay attention to them and recognize and honor them and engage them. That to me is where we can do better.
Great, thank you. So we're down now to our last 10 minutes, which seems like a good opportunity to introduce an audience question that invites us to look sort of forward into Afghanistan's possible future. And I'm just going to read this question. Ira Regmi asks us to ponder the question, what does engagement with the Taliban look like on the part of the international community? What do aid flows that account for a large share of the Afghan budget look like in the future? How do outsiders address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but also acknowledge the need for accountability on the part of Western nations as well as regional neighbors. So, you know, in a nutshell, where do we go from here? What do the possible futures for Afghanistan look like? And as you sort of sketch out in your responses, perhaps, you know, visions of Afghanistan's possible future, if you're willing to attach probabilities to you know, particular futures that you can envision, that would, I think, be much appreciated. I don't know who wants to go first, but it would be great to give each of you an opportunity to ponder the possible future. Okay, Georgi.
All right, let's volunteer. There are always three possibilities. In life, in big history, one is extinction. You know, the country could disappear. And this, unfortunately, you know, has many precedents in history. Before the Mongol invasions, Afghanistan was actually a place later known as Afghanistan was known as the Garden Country. You know, would you believe, you know, that it was mostly Buddhist some centuries earlier, and before that, for a couple centuries, the official language was actually Greek. After the Alexander the Great conquests, which made him great as a conqueror. So there are periods, you know, when countries disappear. You know, populations, however, might change, but they're still there. There is another possibility, of course, you know, that, and I think this is the most remote. The Taliban would be successful in building what we call usually a guerrilla state, something which we saw in Cuba, in Vietnam, an anti-systemic state, probably looking closer to Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1980s, which is not very plausible, both because they don't have an ideology as coherent as the communists used to have in the 20th century, and because so there are many different factions. You know, so it remains to be seen, you know, how this movement could be unified. It might. You know, and second, of course, you know, where the resources are going to come from. You know, Cuba and Vietnam could count on the support of Soviet Union. Taliban might not count, you know, on support of anyone, but probably Pakistan. You know, maybe the United States, for the very pragmatic reason that it's better to have some kind of government, you know, better than the completely terroristic government, you know, than no government. And then the third possibility is something that I'm sorry, you know, but Omar mentioned this as non-possibility. However, I hear the Tajik colleagues speaking about Greater Tajikistan, about Panjshir Valley actually joining, you know, Tajiks joining into Tajikistan. Of course, this is not something, there are always politics into it. There are kind of intellectuals have imagination, but the real politics is that Tajikistan has a president, and it's the same president for the last 29 years. He's vastly less popular than Ahmed Shah, you know, the leader of Tajiks in Panjshir Valley, if he's alive at this moment. You know, so why would he ever welcome Afghan Tajiks, you know, with their charismatic leader into Tajikistan? However, this is in itself is a kernel of a separatist civil war. We might see it flaring up. So the country could just disappear in a collapse. We might see a restoration of authority under under authoritarian and very ideological regime. It happened previously, and we might see a series of separatist civil wars. This is my projection.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to speculate about the possible future?
Well, I can go for that. So just living under the Taliban and actually see them, how they act despite this, their charming offensive in the West right now. I think the whole nature of the Taliban, the way we look at it, an Islamic State, and which has its, and that's a problem because for a lot of Afghans, Islam is a faith, not an ideology, as opposed to Pakistan, and opposed to a lot of Central Asian things. There's a difference between faith and ideology. I mean, Mr. Georgi mentioned about the disintegration stuff, and I think the Taliban is perhaps maybe the only sort of force in the whole country that actually may promote some level of separatism in this country. Not for any other reason, because Taliban, the way they are organized, the way they operate, is not about governing. It's about ruling and living under them and living with this kind of, and within the Taliban, I mean, when we talk about the Taliban, we're not actually talking about a monolithic entity. We're looking at a sort of a diverse group that even part of the ISIS is actually operating in the Taliban. And there are different interests, different groups, and there is an aspect of Taliban which actually thinks about nationals, kind of have the nationalistic tendencies, or at least in a more ethnic level. And we have an aspect of Taliban like Haqqani network, which is extremely internationalist, almost like a Comintern in a Soviet system, with all the jihadis kind of forming different parts of the communists, sort of the groups that actually connect with them. That's why I don't think the Taliban will be able to divorce themselves completely from the international jihadist networks. And that may create a problem. So what we're looking at, despite everything that Pakistan is doing, and despite everything that the Taliban are doing, they're divorced from Al-Qaeda, from Islamic movement in Uzbekistan, from Lashkar-e-Taiba, and from other groups will make them completely illegitimate. And the experience of the transition of all the jihadist groups from Afghanistan to Syria showed that they have very hard time to transition from being a militant group into a political group without kind of disintegrating into smaller entities. So for now, what I'm projecting, which is not very good, Taliban is not about ruling, it's not about governing, it's about ruling, but they are facing a population that actually for the first time in 50 years experienced services, and they want services. And there's concepts such as human rights, women's rights, that actually people are trying to fight for. So we do not know right now, and there is a lot of international politics at play, but I don't believe any of Afghanistan neighbors, whether it is Iran or Pakistan or India or Central Asian states or the United States or Russia or China, actually have a clear idea what to do with this new reality. They're trying to take advantage of it, but I'm not sure what they want to do. But what is kind of constant in effect, we're dealing with an entity which is not monolithic. It's not about governing, it's about ruling, and it has deep and organic ties with international jihadist network, which makes it probably very difficult for all these big states to recognize it. So Afghans, ordinary Afghans, like my family, will be the one who pay the price.
Great, thank you. We only have just a minute or so left now. We're already at noon, and I would like to give both Robert and Dipali an opportunity to sort of look into Afghanistan's future very, very briefly. But before I do that, I'm going to share to everybody on the call, to the audience members, a link to a crowdfund website that the Human Rights Center at Berkeley is running to raise support for Afghan scholars at risk. So please do follow this link, and you sort of give this campaign your consideration. Anything that you can do will be much appreciated and helpful in the effort to provide sort of some assistance for at-risk Afghan academics. Let me ask both Robert and Dipali if you would like to offer some concluding reflections.
Sure. I mean, I think this question that you're asked is a very difficult one, and I agree with Omar. I don't think that the powerful countries in the region, but also the U.S. or the members of the Security Council, I don't think they know yet how to manage this new government, precisely for the reason that's implicit in the question, which is you want to hold this new government accountable, and yet if you entirely isolate it, then you run the risk of isolating Afghans themselves. And just the question, for example, of how to manage the airport is one example. How to think about what kind of humanitarian aid can flow into the country, with whom does one coordinate, presents this very, very thorny question of engagement without recognition. How does that actually work? I think the one advantage the international community has vis-a-vis the Taliban is that this is a group, I think, that is clearly demonstrating a real inability to know how to govern. not just in terms of service delivery, but how to manage a population that has increasingly urbanized and that has grown accustomed to operating internally, but also in a world on certain terms that with which the Taliban is simply unfamiliar. And there's only so much that brute force can get you. And I think in that sense, this is the space within which the international community needs to now navigate, but it's a very difficult question of how to do it.
Great, thank you. And Robert, a concluding reflection?
Thank you. Very briefly, those are all very valuable observations. I think I would echo, some collection of them. And I think going forward, I think the conversation, which is, I think, most forefront in my mind, is really the conversation between those who recently call themselves the Republic, right? The representatives of civil society, and then those who stand for the Emirate. I know that's a simplification, but I think that the conversation that we're seeing on the streets today will, I think, define in part the choices that the Taliban have to make. The national community can still play a role. I mean, there are very few viable options left, unfortunately, but I think there are pressure points that have to be pursued. And I think it's very important that we all continue to pay attention. So again, I thank you all for doing this. I think that it's very striking to watch, even on what I can see from video footage of Herat and other places, that, when cameras are rolling, the Taliban are, in a sense, having to respond to international scrutiny. And that's crucial. And I think staying engaged will be crucial. And the alternative, of course, is a vast and sudden economic collapse, the breakdown of the healthcare system, and then a refugee crisis, which isn't entirely new, but which will spill beyond the region. And they will have effects on politics across the world. I think Biden's choices in the last few months will be remembered for many things. And one of them will be that this is a gift to the far right, to the fascist right in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. So I fear that the polarization that will come from this moment will truly take place on a global scale. And then just the risk of starvation. And I mentioned, from my talk from moments ago, I mean, if the cameras aren't rolling, not only do we see the collapse of healthcare and massive hunger, again, in the context of drought and COVID and so on, but the Taliban could, or aspects of the Taliban, elements of them, may target certain populations for elimination. So that I would not exclude that possibility either. But it's really, truly, I think, a catastrophic policy failure when the national community is left with so few options. And I would highlight too that briefly, it hasn't come up yet, but China and other states are, and Pakistan, I mean, neighboring states, including Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Islamabad, they will step into the vacuum here, and that can have a major effect on stabilizing the Taliban movement so that it can pursue the politics that Omar is critiquing. That is really, I think, in the core values of the movement can still be attainable, especially if they are brought into a kind of regional orbit with these partners who are happy to go along with what the Emirate stands for.
Great, thank you. And that, I'm afraid, is all that we have time for today. But let me just wrap this up by thanking our four panelists for the time they have given us, for the insight that they have brought us. We're in your debt. Thank you very much.